Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Day-to-Day Experiences of Workplace Inclusion and Exclusion, Part 1. We encourage you to follow along on Twitter. We will be using the hashtag Inclusion365, so we encourage you to follow along and tweet along as we go through this webinar. Before we do get started, please note some important housekeeping guidelines. The audio portion of this event should be coming directly through your computer speakers. You can adjust the volume by clicking on the speaker icon at the top of your screen and selecting Adjust Speaker Volume. All participant lines are automatically muted, but if you do have a question, we ask you to type it into the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of the screen there, and type any questions during the presentation, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Thank you again for joining us today. This is Joanna Harper, a member of the Catalyst events team. Catalyst offers monthly webinars such as these. That's a supporter benefit that's free of charge for all individuals at Catalyst supporter organizations. So please do spread the word and tell your colleagues about this valuable benefit. I'm now pleased to introduce today's speakers. Alexandra Pollock is the Director of Research and Regional Director, Mexico and Latin America. In this role, Alex focuses on corporate change strategies and the role of organizational and societal culture in creating inclusive workplaces. As the Regional Director for Mexico and Latin America, Alex plays a lead role in extending Catalyst's work and mission of accelerating progress for women through inclusion to Mexico and other emerging markets in Latin America. Danica J. Travis is the Vice President, Women of Color Research and Center Leader, Catalyst Research Center for Corporate Practice. In this role, Danica is responsible for leading Catalyst research on the advancement and inclusion of women of color in the workplace. As the center leader for Catalyst Research Center for Corporate Practice, Danica distinguishes sound talent management strategies from programmatic fads and documents the best practices. Now over to Alex to begin the presentation.
Thanks very much, Joanna. So in today's webinar, we're going to talk through one of our recent research reports titled The Day-to-Day Experiences of Workplace Inclusion and Exclusion. And what this means is that we'll be sharing some key findings that explore what's really happening for employees inside organizations like yours on a daily basis. What makes them feel included, what makes them feel excluded, and how does this play out on the day-to-day? We'll also share some action steps that can be taken to help manage all of that in your workplace. And we know that all of you will face the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything in between in your work lives. And we'll share some solutions to help leaders do that in ways that will really resonate and respond to the realities of what employees are really experiencing in their day-to-day workplace interactions. So on the next slide, we pose a question for you, which is, how do you define inclusion? And the reason why we're putting that there is because that's a central question to the study that we did leading to this report. And how we got to this idea of day-to-day experiences is that we really wanted to get a better understanding of what inclusion looks like and means to people. And so we asked them just that. How do you define inclusion and how do you experience inclusion in your workplace? Because, of course, as researchers, we can have definitions and formulas galore, but in the end, it's really about the human experience, right? What happens when you show up to work every day and how that affects you both in the moment and then also over time. That really matters. And ultimately, that's what this report is all about. So before we jump in and go into what we found, I invite you to think about how you would answer that question yourself. What is your definition of inclusion? What does inclusion mean to you? What does it feel like? And then how does that contrast with what it means or how it feels to be excluded on the other side of that coin? While you mull that over, let's take a look at what we know about inclusion and exclusion. Based on our inclusive leadership study, we know that inclusion is really about the combination of uniqueness and belongingness. People feel included when they feel both that they are recognized and valued for the things that they bring to the table that are unique and specific about who they are as individuals, while at the same time feeling a sense of belonging, that they are welcomed as part of the team and accepted by their work groups and colleagues. And we know that in order to have inclusion, we need to have both uniqueness and belongingness at the same time. On the other side of that, we know that employees feel excluded when they feel devalued, dismissed, or ignored based on the things that make them different, based on their unique qualities, and or when they are made to feel like they're somehow outsiders, that they don't belong to the group or that they're not welcomed into the group because of their differences, that they're really singled out based on any dimension of difference that you might be able to think of. So again, this is what we know from our research about the formula for inclusion and what exclusion looks like. What we're going to be talking about from here on out is what employees have to say about it, what it feels like, and how they experience inclusion and exclusion in their own work lives. And with that, I'll turn it over to Danica to talk a little bit about how we conducted this study.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Our methodology was informed by qualitative methods in which we did focus groups and in-depth interviews, small group discussions with employees across 42 organizations. We had a phased approach in which we collected data over 3 years in 5 countries, Canada, China, India, Mexico, and the United States. Our goal was simple, as Alex said, to really listen to employees' voices to help us get a handle on inclusion and exclusion in more concrete terms through the daily experiences that they go through every day, that we go through every day. Our analysis was really driven by theory and work that we've done prior in our Culture Matters series. In that first report, we looked and tested a model of organizational change to better understand the successes and setbacks that organizations faced. And we found that relationships were a key part of that. And the second report, Think People, Not Just Programs, to build inclusive workplaces, we also talked a lot about the role of the human element, as Alex talked about earlier, in really creating the inclusive workplaces, and wanted to dig a bit deeper to understand what those experiences were like on a day-to-day, which led to this report that we're talking about now. If we turn to the next slide, broadly, we had 3 critical findings from this report. First, inclusion is hard for employees to grasp, and therefore can feel and seem invisible. Our interviewees found inclusion difficult to define, and that talking about what it feels like on a day-to-day basis was really challenging. Second, there was a salience in the experience of exclusion, meaning that exclusion was really powerfully felt and in many ways could overshadow any experiences of inclusion that employees were undergoing. Unlike inclusion, exclusion experiences are more visible, and as mentioned, painful and really easier to recall. And these experiences build up over time, making it all the more distressing. Lastly, we found that really these feelings of inclusion and exclusion really coexist on a day-to-day basis for employees, and that leaders must understand that these happen at the same time, and this can be quite the dilemma, and we'll talk about that more in depth as we progress through this discussion. So if we dig a little bit into inclusion on the next slide, we talk about and found in the report that inclusion is like air all around us, but ungraspable, intangible, and invisible. And this is a real challenge for leaders, particularly in ways in which we are all trying to create and hold each other accountable for putting programs and initiatives and efforts in place to make inclusion achievable for our employees and with our team members. So for employees, inclusion, our first finding of how and what this invisibility looks like for employees on slide 8, the next slide. We found that human decency and the idea that there's an expectation from many of our interviewees that inclusion is a starting point, meaning that fair treatment, kindness, being a good team member and colleague is just an expectation of being a part of a team or in an inclusive environment, and therefore didn't necessarily need to be called out in some ways. And this quote that we here shows that in force. I'll read a little bit of the quote. "We should have an expectation of how we are going to interact with and treat one another, irrespective of differences. It is almost like, well, you have proven that you can be open-minded and inclusive, or whatever you say about different cultures, different genders, and different viewpoints. So great, let's give you a medal for that, as opposed to you are just a decent human being. And in that quote, you can see that there's just that element, that sense of human decency and being able to treat each other well as a starting point for bridging and creating inclusive environments. In the discussions, and also asking the people that we talked with across these 5 countries about how they define inclusion, even when some may struggle, some actually were able to think about the concept of inclusion, but they thought about it in a more abstract way. They talked about feeling comfortable or having an environment where things are just the way they are in terms of this expectation of being kind and receiving fair treatment. And all of this showed us that inclusion is more than just finding the right words, and that inclusion is really hard to grasp and can be taken for granted or overlooked.
Another one of the challenges, yeah, thank you, Danica. Another one of the challenges that we learned about in talking to employees about how they understand and experience inclusion is that oftentimes interviewees were conflating diversity with inclusion and thinking that they were really one and the same or interchangeable concepts, when in fact they're quite different. And we think this is really happening because inclusion, as we were just talking about, can be invisible. It can be really difficult to define. But seeing individuals of different backgrounds is much more visible and much more easy to describe and to quantify. So when we ask people about how inclusive their organization is, we often got answers that really had a lot more to do with seeing people of different racial and ethnic groups, more colleagues of different nationalities, that they noticed there was a greater representation of women, more out LGBT employees, things like that. And while, of course, those are all wonderful indicators of diversity, it's not the same thing as inclusion in the cultural sense. So we're seeing here that it's much easier for people to point to workforce diversity as a barometer for whether or not the environment is inclusive, but they're actually missing some of the core components of inclusion that really have to do more with the combination of uniqueness and belongingness, which has to do with how people are treated. So not just about who's present in the room, but what those interactions look like once they're there and what kind of culture is being created. And the problem with that is that observable growth in diversity is being mistaken as the same thing as defining or indicating a presence of inclusion. And for organizations that are really trying to push forward on creating more inclusion in their workplaces, what it means is that a lot of people look around them and say, well, I see more diversity here, so I'm not really sure why we're doing this anymore. We already have inclusion. But again, diversity and inclusion are two very different things, and that can pose a real challenge for leaders. And that's something we'll come back to a little bit later in terms of some solutions. The other finding that we came to in our research was that personal connections are really critical. People had a hard time defining inclusion or explaining how it happens, but what was absolutely clear to them is that relationships matter. Time and again, when we ask questions about how you define inclusion or how you experience inclusion, we got responses that look a lot like the quotes on this slide here. People talking about respect, people talking about putting people first, and the interaction that they have with their colleagues and the way that those interactions impact their lives. So to build on inclusion, employees really believe that these personal connections with colleagues are critical. Through building strong relationships, through collaboration with others, and through open and transparent conversations. And while they may not have used the word inclusion or some of the definitions of inclusion that we use, it's clear that these kinds of personal connections are really a key to driving inclusion for employee experiences. Now, contrary to what we're talking about with inclusion being invisible, when it comes to exclusion, as you can see on the next slide, exclusion is like suffocating, where inclusion is like breathing, in that inclusion may be the air that we breathe all around us but invisible. Exclusion is something that we feel really acutely, that really sticks in our minds, that can be very painful to us, and it's very easy to recall the experience of feeling excluded. And the challenge here, of course, is that everyday exclusionary experiences can really overshadow inclusive ones. So you may have many inclusive experiences in a day and then only one exclusionary one. The exclusionary one is the one that's going to really stick in your mind. So I'll turn it back over to Danica to talk a little bit about what exactly that looks like and feels like for employees.
Great, thank you, Alex. So exclusion, as Alex mentioned, is that build-up that over time that really impacts how people experience the workplace and their colleagues and team members and their interactions. And what we found here is that there were three major areas that we heard from our interviewees around what this sense of exclusion was like. There's those feelings of tokenism and feeling related to feeling like another or being the only one within their workforce. That was really critical and talked about quite frequently. We also heard lots of stories around bias and stereotyping, as you probably would expect. And then there were mixed messages related to flex and work-life experience, effectiveness that also employees experienced as exclusionary. So on the next slide, if we want to get into tokenism a little bit more, that feeling of being the only can be quite difficult, particularly when interviewees were asked about their colleagues who represent non-dominant groups or how they're perceived in organizations or how they experience the workplace themselves. Interviewees noticed that either people were being singled out because of group characteristics, whether it be the race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, country of origin, anything that made them distinct. Or some interviews talked about their own experiences in firsthand in real gut-wrenching ways about when they felt excluded, and they remember those experiences quite candidly and in many ways have come to resent them. The quotes on the slide shows an example of that in action. Next, if we look at the next slide, that bias and stereotyping also were a powerful example of the felt experience of exclusion. Biases are the implicit associations or attitudes that inform our perceptions about people or group, were quite frequently talked about and felt in many ways. The subtle forms of bias and stereotypes were discussed in terms of how harmful they could be and hard for employees to combat or address. Some of our interviewees talked about humor and different offhand remarks that they felt were distressing and could easily recall stories where they were told things or were part of conversations that just didn't go over well and those stuck with them. Also, we heard conversations about and discussions around more blatant experiences of discrimination and bias that employees talked about as well. Finally, on the mixed messages around work-life effectiveness, one of the most compelling aspects of our research was that interviewees were very candid about the mixed messages they heard, particularly when it comes to flexibility efforts or work-life experiences. And they experienced these messages as exclusionary, and this happened for women and men alike. Interestingly, and this I think presents a further challenge for leaders, is that some of the human resource and diversity inclusion practitioners that we interviewed talked about their policies and their programs with great regard and respect, yet when employees talked about not necessarily those programs specifically, but just about their day-to-day experiences, it really painted a different picture of their lived and daily reality. And we'll speak more about this when Alex talks about the coexistence. Alex?
Sure. So on the next slide, this is really a critical piece of our finding from all of this research, and that is that on any given day, we learned and we know that employees experience both inclusive and exclusive interactions and experiences all the time, that it's not all or nothing. So to say that you have an inclusive workplace does not mean that there is never going to be exclusionary behavior or exclusionary experiences. And likewise, if you are facing challenges with exclusion, that does not mean that there aren't inclusionary moments that are happening throughout the day for your employees. And this is something that was really salient for everyone that we spoke with, that it's really not all or nothing, one or the other. It's really both. And navigating that reality is particularly critical for employees and for their managers who are trying to help steer the course toward a more inclusive workplace. So our first finding in this section around coexistence is precisely that. Inclusion and exclusion are not all or nothing. Treating them as separate, treating them as fully distinct from each other really doesn't capture the reality of how employees experience the day-to-day of what it feels like to go to work and spend their days in your organization. There can really be an element of both, and that may mean recognizing that the organizational culture is quite inclusive as an overall, and yet still having exclusionary experiences with one particular manager, or feeling excluded from a particular project, or having challenges with work-life, for example, as Danica just mentioned, recognizing still that there are inclusionary moments that are happening all around you. The second finding in this coexistence section is really talking about a disconnect between formal programs and informal norms. And I think this is something that will likely resonate for everyone on this webinar today, and for most organizations around the globe, that despite all of the best intentions and the best laid plans for strong programs and policies to create a more inclusive workplace, that doesn't always tell the whole story in terms of what employees actually experience and live on a day-to-day. They don't always see the dots being connected between what the organization says it's doing or what's written down on paper and what they actually feel they're experiencing. And the quote here, I think, captures that quite well. Right? Having a practice or a policy is one part, but actually implementing that is quite a different story. And this does not mean, of course, that formal approaches aren't working or that they shouldn't be implemented. Not at all. Programs and policies, we know, are really important. It does just mean that they don't represent the whole story, and that's not the end-all and be-all of how to create inclusion. While expressing appreciation for their organization's efforts to promote these programs and policies, interviewees repeatedly described observing a gap with informal norms, and really were asking for and believing that their organizations could do better. And again, a lot of that boiled down to individual interactions and relationships with managers. The third finding from this section is about translating opportunity into impact. And this is a place where people really highlighted examples of practices, again, opening the door for change in terms of informal norms, but questioning whether or not their organizations would, in fact, be successful at making those connections. So this is closely related to the previous finding. And the quote here tells a story that I think is really great, so if you'll oblige me, I'll try to sum it up quickly. There was an organization that held a town hall type forum and asked a question about a particular policy that had recently been implemented about whether or not it was inclusive. And the leader at the front of the room said yes and went on to explain why. And everyone around the room had been provided at their tables a paddle that said BS on it, and they were told to hold up the paddle anytime they disagreed with what was being said. And lo and behold, every single BS paddle went up around the room. And I think this is such a great example of coexistence, because the fact that all those paddles went up is saying that there is something exclusionary that's happening. They were disagreeing with the idea that that new policy was inclusive. But at the same time, the act of having this forum, asking that question, and providing those BS paddles around the room is, in fact, a very inclusive process of collecting feedback, having two-way dialogue, having transparency, and an opportunity for real honest and open dialogue. So that's coexistence, I think, summed up in a story of both inclusion and exclusion happening at the same time. The question that remains is, where do you go from there? Is the organization going to be able to take that opportunity to connect the dots to make the change that's needed to make sure that that exclusionary moment is translated into an inclusive opportunity? And that brings us to our actions for leaders, the steps that you all can take to really help make change based on what we learned. And it boils down to three main things. We want to amplify inclusion, we want to interrupt exclusion, and we want to manage coexistence. So the first piece of that is really about helping to make the invisible visible. We want to hold ourselves and others accountable for creating and broadcasting a shared vision of inclusion. We want to be visible and explicit about rewarding inclusive behavior when we see it happening. We want to give airtime and reinforce inclusive behaviors and set the precedent that inclusion is something that happens every day, all the time, in small ways and big ways, not only something that occurs privately behind closed doors in the HR room or something that happens in big splashy ways with new global rollouts of programs and policies. In terms of interrupting exclusion, we really want to pay attention to who's being included and more importantly in this case, who's being left out, who is not being validated, who's being ignored and dismissed during meetings, and making sure to interrupt and break in when you see that happening. It's about actively seeking feedback from those who don't usually contribute, role modeling inclusive behaviors in terms of recognizing diverse opinions and showing that they have value by repeating them and building on them in meetings and as discussions evolve. It's about giving credit and visibility where it's due. So if you hear someone make a point and then it goes without recognition, a few minutes later someone else makes the same point and is praised for it, to jump in and say, you know, thanks so much for reiterating the point that this other person brought up before. I agree that that was really important, and I'm so glad that you brought that back on the table. Perhaps the person who originally raised the idea can elaborate, things like that. And in terms of coexistence, it's really about managing the reality of inclusion and exclusion happening at the same time. And the part of that is paying attention to the human side of change. We know it can be really difficult for those who are invested in programs and policies to recognize that while there may be progress being made in those areas, that exclusion continues to persist. But validating the reality of those experiences is really important and helps employees feel like they're really being heard, and transparently acknowledging the barriers that exist and recognizing and working through setbacks. While it shows vulnerability, while it will expose some of the things that aren't going well, it actually goes a really long way to making employees feel like they are included and like the organization is making progress. And with that, I want to point to another product that was recently released along with this report, which is an infographic showing how you can be inclusive every day. And this is also a call to action to all of you to find the ways, big and small, and in this case mostly small, to be inclusive in your everyday interactions, to not only pay lip service to the change you want to see and the values you believe in, but really walk the talk to amplify inclusion and help make it more visible, and to interrupt exclusion without sweeping it under the rug and pretending like it's not there.
And so with that in mind, in terms of the solutions and the actions that we each can take to be able to create more inclusive environments, we are going to have a part 2 to this discussion where we get into many of the different aspects of strategies and solutions and examples and stories from organizations and individuals in terms of how they've been able to bring more inclusive environments to existence, as well as manage the kind of aspects of inclusion and exclusion that coexist in the same space. So we look forward to you joining us then.
Perfect. Thank you, Danica and Alex, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We would like to invite everyone who's interested to become active members of our social media platforms that you can see on the screen here. And each of them do have a slightly different engagement value. You'll also see on the screen a box that says resources. If you click on any of the ones listed there, it will direct you to our website and how to access these resources, including registering for the webinar that Danica just mentioned, the part 2 of this webinar taking place on November 14th. And we do encourage you to sign up and attend on November 14th between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. Eastern, where we will learn concrete strategies that leaders and organizations have relied on to make employees' day-to-day experiences more inclusive. We look forward to everyone tuning in next time. Please be sure to pass along the invitation to your colleagues, and of course, visit us at catalyst.org/events for upcoming engagement opportunities. Thank you all for attending and have a great day.